Panasonic LUMIX have done something super special with this lens. It's the 100mm f2.8 macro, and that combination in and of itself isn't necessarily anything special. It's a short telephoto macro lens, but what they have done with it is made it so much more than just a macro lens. I mean, look at how tiny this thing is. It's the smallest and lightest autofocus macro lens that you can get, as far as I'm aware. So, secure the cup, let's find some things to shoot with it and talk about this lens. First things first with this lens, if you're familiar with the LUMIX prime lens lineup, this is gonna look really familiar, and that's because it uses the same housing as the 18, 24, 35, 50, and 85mm f1.8 primes. So it's the same 82 millimeters long, and it uses the same 67mm thread on the front. And the weights between all of them are very close, so that makes switching between all of those lenses, if you've got kind of a kit going on, really great. Now, that being said, just like the other ones, this doesn't have a lot of bells and whistles. It is dust and moisture weather sealed, and it's got an autofocus manual focus toggle, as well as nice action on the manual focus ring itself. The one thing that this does have that the others don't is a focus range limiter, which is super handy for macro stuff, so it makes sense that they would have put it on this lens. But comparing this to the other primes in the LUMIX lineup isn't necessarily where this shines. It's when you start to compare it to its competitors. Like I said before, the 100mm macro is tiny. It's only 82 millimeters long and 298 grams for its weight. If we were to look at some of the competitors in this same kind of short telephoto macro lens category, we've got the Canon 100, we've got the Sony 90mm, and then we've got the Sigma 105mm. All of them are f2.8 lenses, all of them have autofocus, and they all have 1:1 macro capabilities. The Canon actually has 1.4:1 macro capabilities. But they're all giants compared to the LUMIX. Compared to the 82mm length, we've got 148, 130, and 133 millimeters. And comparing to that 298 gram weight, we've got 730, 602, and 715 grams for the other three. So that means that the LUMIX is less than half the weight of the next lightest one. One thing that the LUMIX lens is missing compared to the Sony and Canon competitors is optical stabilization. Panasonic claims that they don't necessarily need it, that the IBIS in their cameras are rated up to 135 millimeters, so this would come within that range. I haven't run into a whole bunch of problems with it. I'm a little bit of a shaky hand kind of person, so 100mm is pretty far out there to not have optical stabilization, but like I said, I've been having a good time with it and haven't run into any big problems. As far as price goes, the LUMIX is $1,000 US right now, which is pretty comparable to the other ones here, except for the Sigma, which is $200 cheap. So of course, all of this has me thinking, they managed to make it lighter and smaller, and they still kept it in the same price range, so they must have sacrificed on image quality, right? I've actually been quite impressed with the image quality that I've been getting out of this lens, both for macro stuff and for just kind of regular purpose short telephoto stuff. It doesn't necessarily have a huge wow factor for me, like I'm not taking photos and like being completely blown away by them, but it performs really well. The general look, colors, and contrast I thought looked really nice. The sharpness was solid, both in the centers and all the way out to the edge. It had a really nice balance to the sharpness. And in general, I just kind of didn't run into any big image quality problems, even when I was specifically trying to push it a little bit. I didn't have any trouble with excessive flaring or chromatic aberration, and I was definitely actively looking for those trade-offs for the size and weight, and I just wasn't really finding much. One of the ways that I wanted to test out this lens was for the actual macro capabilities, and I found these little antique vintage keys at an antique shop, and so I thought I would take some photos of those and was really happy with how they turned out. I even tried the auto focus stacking function inside my S5 IIX, where it automatically takes a bunch of different photos at a bunch of different focus points so that you can then combine them afterwards, which is something that's pretty common in macro photography, and I thought they turned out really well. I did both the key as well as my Doctor Who TARDIS pin, and one of the things that stood out is is that there is so little focus breathing, and they've done that all optically inside the lens, so you're not relying on any kind of software to do that afterwards. And again, when you're taking all of those different focus shots, you definitely want your focus breathing to be as minimal as possible. So as far as image quality goes, I was definitely happy, and we've now got a smaller, lighter 100mm macro that we can lug around more easily. But all of that isn't even necessarily my favorite part about this lens. There's still more. Now, I'm not gonna claim that I'm an expert in macro photography or with macro lenses, but I have definitely owned a couple, including that 105mm Sigma that I talked about earlier, and I've definitely used a handful more, like that Sony 90mm that I talked about earlier as well. And in my experience, they've all kind of had one thing in common. While they are great as macro lenses in specific macro situations, they all kind of struggled as general purpose 100mm lenses. So I found myself using macro lenses only as macro lenses, and then switching over to something else in the situations where I might need a short telephoto lens, because there were just too many drawbacks as far as the kind of usefulness and the what is the word I'm looking for? The user experience. They just didn't work the way that I wanted them to work in those other situations. And specifically, autofocus seemed to be a thing that really struggled on these other macro lenses. And all of this got to the point where I literally sold off every macro lens that I owned because they just weren't getting used. I wasn't doing enough macro photography or videography that I even needed them. And it would definitely be nice if you could use your macro lens as a general purpose lens as well. And that's one thing that they've done really well with this Lumix 100mm macro. If you just handed it to me and didn't tell me it was a macro lens, just said, here's a 100mm lens, go use it, I would say that it performs pretty similarly to the other prime lenses in the Lumix lineup. So for the first time in my experience, I could confidently use a macro lens for the macro things that it's intended for, but also just as a walk around lens or for portraits or for street photography, kind of whatever you need it for. Now, it's not to say that those other lenses can't physically do those things, they just didn't do them as well as you would expect a general prime lens to do, whereas this one seems to hold up a bit better. And part of that, of course, comes down to the fact that it's so much smaller and lighter than those other ones. You actually want to bring it with you. You actually want to keep it on your body so that you can shoot with it. And another part of it has to do with the dual phase linear motors that they've put into this lens. It's something that is new to Lumix, and it definitely performed well. And all of this translates really well over to video too. I can see myself using this for product videos, B-roll that is either macro or otherwise. It performed really well with the autofocus. It was accurate and smooth. Even when I was sliding in towards the subject, it held its own really well. So while I wouldn't say that this lens necessarily pushes image quality to a new level compared to its competitors, it definitely holds its own. And I think there are two things that really make it special in its class. First of all, the size and weight of this lens are unheard of in this category, which is really awesome. It actually makes you want to pack it in your bag and take it just in case. And second of all is that general usability. It works as just a 100mm lens without any of the trade-offs that I'm typically used to when I use those short telephoto macro lenses. But as always, I want to hear from you. Are you excited about the Lumix 100mm macro, and are you going to pick one up for your kit? Leave a comment down below, and on your way down, if you got something out of this video, hit that like and subscribe button. There are links down in the description, of course, if you want to go get more info or if you want to pick one up. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. I did it, I filmed a video.